to contribute briefly to the Industrial and Provident Societies Amendment Bill brought before us by my Independence for Change colleagues here tonight. It's a long overdue bill, Can Corla, that will amend, of course, the Industrial and Provident Societies Act 1893 in important respects, as colleagues have outlined, and provide for connecting matters. A cooperative, of course, by definition, is an autonomous association of persons united to meet common economic, social and cultural goals, and they achieve their objectives through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. And of course, the co-op movement, if you look back historically, it emerged after the Industrial Revolution because of the upheavals and the very bad treatment, I suppose, of workers and producers in that era. And in England, you had people like Robert Owen and the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers, and in Europe, the Raiffeisen banks. You know, they emerged as cooperative credit providers in response to very restrictive credit conditions. As colleagues have outlined, of course, we've had a long history of the cooperative effort here ourselves under the leadership of Sir Horace Plunkett, R.A. Anderson, Father Finlay and others. Of course, the IAOS, the Irish co-ops, thrived from the 1890s, and we're very proud of their history down to the decades. My colleague has said, of course, that some of these co-ops then morphed into PLCs, you know, you have to say that some of the responsibility for that lies with you, Minister, because you haven't come forward with modernising legislation, and you didn't want to. Your party, and indeed I have to say, unfortunately, Fianna Fáil as well, didn't want to support the cooperative movement. I think Deputy Connolly mentioned also, and Deputy Pringle, Father McDwyer, the famous Father James McDwyer, and the Corcum and the Nilon. So we have a really proud tradition in this area going right back. We've seen cooperative financial services with the establishment of the credit union movement, which I think, you probably remember, I think it came to this country through from the United States through the great John Hume, who started the first one in Derry, and then all around the country credit unions started to develop. And in fact, the government's attitude to cooperative development was actually shown to some extent in the crash era, in the way it dealt with the credit unions and with the building societies, because for no good reason, Minister Lenihan, he backed the Educational Building Society, for example, which was owned by its depositors, including my own family. He backed that into Allied Irish banks. And similarly with credit unions, he put forward $250 million or something for money because credit unions were kind of going to collapse. But he never said, of course, that something like only 14 or 15 million was used. So Fine Gael's attitude to credit unions, to the cooperatively owned financial sector has always been, I think, a very bad attitude and not been supportive. And I think, in fact, we welcome we welcome the fact now that credit unions, I know one of the unions in my own constituency, the Progressive, that they're about to launch a current account with debit card and chequebook and so on. That's a very valuable development. Well, I mean, it could have happened 30 years ago, but it didn't happen because Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were not prepared to bring in the legislation to make it possible. We're all familiar, of course, with the development co-ops in Europe, the Sparkassen Bank. We still wonder why it hasn't been allowed to come into this country or been encouraged to come into this country to give us, we've had complaints, and I hear Deputy McGrath week in, week out, how come we're paying 4%, the rest of Europe was paying 1% and so on, minimum interest rates. Why is that the case? And of course, one of the reasons is that, the Sparkassen and other groups like that, they weren't encouraged. We've been very familiar, of course, with co-op housing as well. We have the NABCO, various other approved housing bodies who also operate on a cooperative basis. We've small streets in my constituency, for example, Minister, that were built by a group of teachers, nurses, other people working together who actually created their own housing. We're familiar too, and you're very familiar, Minister, with the Group Water Schemes programme. Indeed, just recall, of course, Horace Plunkett was from your own constituency, wasn't he, Minister? I think from Dunsany. It's a powerful tradition in our country, and it does seem to me that in the interim period, like particularly following the Thatcher-Reagan, the horrible years of grotesque capitalism, we totally neglected this sector, and that's why this bill. Sorry. Grotesque capitalism, first and foremost, I mean, at least the Chinese, they're building houses, which this government is not doing, with their state construction company. So we have a long and proud cooperative history, and it's still visible today. But I do think there's a legal lacuna, and that's the reason, Minister, you're coming along here tonight and you tell us, we need a consolidation. I've been looking for consolidation of the traffic acts for about 15 or 20 years, nearly as long as I've been in this House. I'm still looking for it. I mean, you don't make any mention will you refer this to the Law Reform Commission? Let the Law Reform Commission come up. If you want a comprehensive bill, of which our bill could be part, will you go forward then and actually do it and stop talking about it, or stop, you didn't even mention the Law Reform Commission, whether or not they've ever had that task. And as I said, Europe, of course, has had a great history as well in that regard. And I think that's the reason for that. My colleague, Deputy Collins, mentioned Italy. We also know about Spain, particularly the Basque Country, Mondragon. You're probably familiar with Can Corla, this powerful, huge cooperative for the Basque nation. They are a nation and within Spain, and they played a huge role in promoting the economic well-being of the Basque people, and indeed of the whole people of the Iberian Peninsula. But I think the legal systems, the supporting legal systems of those countries is more supportive and better than ours, and that's the key point that we're raising here. And of course, we shouldn't forget the UK, the great tradition the UK has. We're all familiar with John Lewis stores, where the 70,000 workers own their own company. Waitrose, their famous food company, their food retailer, and in John Lewis, if you walk into a John Lewis store in Liverpool or Manchester or whatever, you know that the people on the floor own that company. It's their company. And we also, of course, great tradition in the British Labour Party with the co-op. A lot of MPs are actually co-op MPs. It's a Labour and Cooperative Party in the UK. But as I said, our legislation, it's amazing. It's dating back to 1893. You mentioned about the 2014 Act, but again, you had an opportunity over the 8 years, I think, to modernise legislation. It hasn't really been taken, and it's amazing that we're still relying on United Kingdom legislation going back before independence. When we celebrate 100 years of Dáil Éireann, maybe we could have given the tradition that we've all outlined in co-ops and worker-owned industrial bodies, that we couldn't have had modernising legislation. So the bill reduces membership course criteria from 7 down to 3. Now, you said you had a consultation on that, and you mentioned Finland, I think, and various other countries. But like we've noted, I think it was my colleague Deputy Daly, in the introduction of the bill, Deputy Daly said that in 2014 there were 237,753 SMEs, small and medium industries in Ireland, employing 919,000 to almost a million workers. But it's an average, our SMEs have an average of 3.87 employees per business, so just over 3. So this is the logic of where we came up with the 3 as being the number that you should pursue. So I don't see again why that's one you couldn't support and you couldn't have addressed. It allows, obviously, the bill. You're saying the audit exemptions available to you're saying it's only unlimited companies that can have this, and that you have a reservation about that. But you have to acknowledge, Minister, the cost of an audit. For many small co-ops and social enterprises which are not focused on profits but just on service delivery for their communities, it can make the model very unattractive. You need to keep it simple. And you also mentioned then in relation to the electronic filing, and that there's an SI there, I think, already that Minister Humphreys has brought people in to see, and so on and so forth. But again, you could put it on a legislative basis. I don't see why we couldn't put it on a full legislative basis rather than just a statutory instrument. But I think the small amendments in the bill and the discussion we've had here tonight is very, very valuable, because I think you don't deny, Minister, this is a very important sector, and I think my colleague Deputy Pringle actually outlined a very strong case how it can become more and more important in the future. For example, in energy, in coping with climate change, that will get communities together, get people working together. Renewables, I think it has amazing potential as well. Still in finance, the cooperatives, I think it has amazing potential in social media, for example. You notice the way some newspapers are becoming, in actual fact, in order to survive, because they can't survive physically, but online, they're becoming the property of their readers. And that, again, is a wonderful development, a wonderful way of sustaining newspapers. So there are so many positive examples in our history, as I said, of finance, housing, so many other, agriculture, other services. So I think it's our hope the bill would, make the establishment of a co-op that much easier, and encourage all those community groups and local workers to adapt to the model, which really benefits the whole of societies. And co-ops, they're based on very strong values, good jobs and services, and beneficial to communities. And Minister, all my career, including the time long before I was in politics, I've always been involved in social enterprise. I'm still a director of a number of community companies today, and you know, I know year in, year out, board meeting after board meeting, the requirements that we have to make to fulfil the statutory rules. But I think people are prepared to do that if they're simple and if they're presented very, very easily. So you know, I think first you could kick the ball off tonight by just accepting the legislation. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.